Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Miner's Stubborn Bride. Chapter 1. The sun was setting as Benjamin Heartache pulled his stallion to a stop in front of her. The light glistened from his tanned skin, and he glowered at her from underneath the broad brim of his leather hat. "Didn't I tell you to stay put?" White teeth flashed as he growled at her. Elsie Courage, exhausted with terror and hundreds of miles away from everything she loved, nearly cried with relief. Holding back her tears, she nodded silently. In one smooth movement, Benjamin reached down and pulled her up into the saddle with him. She felt impossibly small and dainty next to his broad shoulders. "Thank goodness you've got a mind of your own," he said, and embraced her. As the sun finally sank over the horizon, Sadie Owen looked up, blue eyes wide with shock. There was no denying the noise that her younger sister made, clattering down the hall in her uncomfortable, but so very stylish, shoes. She was heading for Sadie's bedroom, which meant that Sadie had only about 10 seconds to hide her work. Tearing herself away from the ongoing tale of Elsie Courage and her cowboy love, Benjamin Heartache, she shuffled the papers together and pushed them in the top drawer of her desk just in time for Melly to burst through the door. "There you are." Sadie huffed out a breath, amused despite herself. "Well, this is my bedroom, after all," she pointed out. "Where else should I be?" Melly put her hands on her hips. At just 17, 5 years younger than Sadie, she was accustomed to being the center of attention and the belle of the ball. Much like her older sister, she gloried in wavy blonde hair and wide blue eyes. Unlike her sister, however, she paid close attention to how she dressed, where she was seen wearing it, and with whom. "I don't suppose it matters to you that Jerry Warner is down below in the sitting room with his hat on his knee, politely discussing the weather with Mother while he waits for you to arrive." "I don't suppose it does, either," said Sadie candidly. She realized suddenly that her pen and much spotted blotting paper were still in full view, telling a tale of her favorite hobby. To divert attention from them, she stood abruptly and moved toward the door, putting an arm through her sister's and drawing her with her. "But I'm sure that it matters to Mother." "Of course, it does. Jerry Warner is one of the richest bachelors on this side of town. And if he doesn't matter to you, then I wish you would just up and tell him so that I can have a go." Sadie couldn't help but laugh. Her younger sister was both flirtatious and rather rash. It was amusing from a distance but could be a damaging combination up close. "Let's leave poor Jerry Warner alone. I'm sure he has enough trouble without dragging the Owen sisters into it. But he's here because he intends to court you." "Nonsense, child. He's here because Father and Mr. Warner have been close business associates for the past decade, and now that Mr. Warner is getting ready to hand the reins over to his son, it only makes sense that Jerry pays a polite social visit." Handing over the reins, an idea flashed through her head. Could Benjamin Heartache decide to teach Elsie Courage to ride, and their hands tangle together in the reins as he steadies her grip? Sadie came back to herself with a start, realizing that she was standing with one foot poised over the first step, not quite moving forward. Melly jostled her elbow. "Goodness, Sadie. Sometimes I think that you've fallen asleep with your eyes wide open." But she had no excuse. At least, no excuse that she wanted to present to her little sister. She shook her head, pulled Melly's arm in closer, and hurried down the stairs. "Never mind. We mustn't keep poor Jerry Warner waiting. I'm sure no one has ever been so rude to him in his life, and he won't have the faintest idea of what to do." Her tone was joking, but her words were probably true. The young man who sat with his hat on his knee, looking around the sitting room as though he would never have decorated it in such a shade, was clearly on edge, and it wasn't solely due to Mrs. Owen's attempts to refill his teacup before he was quite ready for it. "Ah, girls, there you are. Mrs. Owen trilled, abandoning her attempts to capture the steadily moving cup and pouncing on her daughters instead. What on earth kept you? Sadie was daydreaming away, as usual, said Melly candidly. She took a seat on the settee directly across from young Mr. Warner, so as to show her pretty face off to the best advantage and presented him with a smile. The heir apparent gave an expression that was not so much a smile as a twitch of the mouth, and turned his attention to Sadie, who would really rather that he hadn't. She took a seat next to her mother, just to Mr. Warner's left, so that he had to turn his head awkwardly to see her. I was beginning to think that you were allergic to my company, he said. This is the third time this week that I've called and been told that you were busy elsewhere. Oh, why, Sadie floundered for a moment. Truth be told, she had no excuse to give. But she was a writer, wasn't she? If she couldn't talk her way out of a conversation like this, then she didn't deserve the name. I'm sure you understand how it is, she said, remembering that presentation is more persuasive than any actual content. To distract him further from the subject, she reached out and laid a hand so briefly on his arm, then drew it back again. How are your parents, Mr. Warner? And your younger sister? I understand that she is to make her debut this season. As a matter of fact, Sadie understood nothing of the sort. She was vaguely aware of young Amaryllis Warner as being all bark and no bite, the kind of girl who leads teeth first, and Sadie had only the faintest notion of how old the girl must be. Surely, she must be somewhere around 16. Her supposition was a shot in the dark, but her speculation was rewarded when Jerry Warner relaxed into the subject, apparently mollified about her former rudeness. In the discussion that followed, Sadie's attention wandered widely. It was all about upcoming balls and parties and other types of social gatherings, things which made her feel so dreadfully itchy just to contemplate that it really did seem she might be allergic. Instead, she let her mind drift back to the stack of papers waiting for her upstairs, tucked away securely in the desk drawer, and limited her interaction to nods and the occasional, you don't say, and goodness, just to keep herself from getting in trouble. She could tell, however, that her little sister was suspicious that her mind was not on the matter at hand. Melly kept giving her narrow-eyed glances. By the time that Jerry Warner finally wrapped up his visit and left, Sadie burst out, Melly, is there something in your eye? You keep squinting at me. You weren't paying the least bit of attention to Jerry. Of course, I was, said Sadie. I was here the whole time, wasn't I, responding? Really? Melly folded her arms. Then what did he talk about? Oh, the same old thing that everyone talks about. Balls and parties and social events. He mentioned a very specific one, Melly countered, her eyebrows jumping at each clearly pronounced word. Of course, you picked up on that, as closely as you were minding his words. Sadie hesitated, and glanced at her mother for confirmation and a clue, but her mother was certainly not going to offer her any help. She folded her arms and directed the exact same expression at Sadie as her younger daughter was currently displaying. The, midsummer dance? Sadie hazarded. It's early spring, Melly pointed out. Oh, yes. The mid-spring dance? You know there's no such thing. Sadie shook her head and sighed. Goodness, if you're so keen on me knowing precisely what you're talking about, then you should really just tell me instead of making me guess. The debutante ball for Amaryllis, of course. Really, Sarah, said Mrs. Owen severely, and Sadie knew by her mother's use of her Christian name rather than her nickname that Mrs. Owen was disappointed indeed. It's downright rude to ignore what someone is saying to you. Especially a distinguished visitor like Gerald Warner. It's embarrassing to all involved, and it certainly doesn't reflect well on your respect for him, or for your family. Sadie sighed again. There was no way out of this one. I'm sorry, Mother. It's just, you know how I feel about social events. I should imagine that everyone does, the way you carry on. You'd think that we're forcing you to lie on beds of hot coals instead of simply pass polite conversation with pleasant company. Mrs. Owen stood, shaking out her skirts in a characteristic display of irritation. I would say that perhaps you'll think better of your attitude as you get older, but at your age, I suppose I can't hold out much hope of you ever changing. Her mother's words stung. Sadie didn't look at her distaste for social events as a character flaw, but simply a difference of opinion. But the way her family viewed it, it amounted to a betrayal of the family name, if not outright sacrilege. Mrs. Owen swept regally from the room, leaving Sadie to stand up slowly, smoothing down her skirt. "Where are you going?" her sister asked, watching her with keen eyes. "Back upstairs, I suppose." "I've nowhere else to go." "What do you do up there all day?" It wasn't the first time that the question had been asked, but this time, her sister's tone of voice was so suspicious. Sadie's back straightened in a defensive posture. "I read," she said, because it wasn't entirely a lie. She turned smartly on her heel, marching toward the door. "How can you simply read all day?" called her sister after her. "Anyone would have a headache." But Sadie didn't turn back. She continued on up the stairs and didn't stop moving until she was seated at her desk once more, the door closed behind her securely. Reverently, she opened the drawer and pulled the stack of papers from their resting place, smoothing her fingertips over her writing. She didn't like having to keep things secret from her parents, she didn't like telling little fibs about her hobbies. But her stories were sacred to her, in the same way that social events were sacred to her family. The trouble was, her family had as little interest in her choice of interests as she did in theirs. No, it was worse than that. Sadie knew that if her parents ever found out how much time and effort she put into writing, and even that she had dared to send some of her stories to a magazine to submit for publication, they would be downright horrified. To write was a common pursuit, not worthy of someone of the Owens' caliber. And she knew, with a terrible sad certainty, that nothing she ever said or did would convince them otherwise. Chapter 2. Sadie. The hasty movement to shuffle her papers together and tuck them out of sight was becoming second nature to her these days. And just when she was in the middle of a particularly exciting shootout in the local saloon, too. The voice calling her didn't belong to her sister this time, however, but to her mother. In the last few days since the visit from Jerry Warner, Mrs. Owen had gradually gotten over her irritation with her older daughter, but it was evident from the way she kept looking at Sadie and shaking her head that she was still quite disappointed. Somewhat concerned that the summons was only going to lead to another display of disapproval, or, worse, another interview with Mr. Warner, Sadie got up from her desk and went to the door, opening it swiftly before her mother could. "Oh, there you are. Sadie, June forgot to bring in the paper for your father, and she's elbow deep in washing dishes at the moment. Will you run down to the corner and get one?" This was a much less contentious request than she had been expecting, and Sadie was happy to agree, fetch her shawl, and leave the house. The maid usually brought a paper from the newsboy only a block away, and the walk was short but pleasant. On the way back, newspaper tucked under her arm, she took a few extra moments to watch the few passers-by, wondering whether any of them ever read or wrote secretly, as she did. She was away from home for only 20 minutes, but when she stepped back inside, she knew at once that things had changed. She could hear hushed voices from the sitting room, and even without discerning the words, it was clear that they were not happy. "Sarah Owen," her father called, "come here, if you please." To hear her father call her by her full name was almost a shock. She felt her heart sink somewhere in the vicinity of her toes. Dreading what might come next, she went down the hall to the sitting room. Her parents were sitting together, with Melly standing nearby. As Sadie stepped in, all three of them looked up at her. What made her heart beat faster, however, was the instantly recognizable stack of ink-spotted paper that her father held in both hands. He lifted it up to her. "Can you explain this, daughter?" She trembled at the sight. How did you get that?" "I found it," Melly volunteered. She folded her arms. "I knew you were hiding something, Sadie, but I never would have thought it was this." "There's nothing wrong with it." Sadie flared back at her. "They're just my stories, it's nothing so terrible." She reached her hands out to her father, beseechingly. "It's only a hobby." Her father cleared his throat. "Hobbies are respectable pastimes," he said. "Things that society ladies can sit and discuss, helping the poor, planning teas and charity events. I certainly would not call this," he brandished the papers, "a hobby." "I am so disappointed," said her mother, wringing her hands in her lap. To think that you've been ignoring your social duties to sit by yourself and make up stories. I love to write, Sadie said quietly. She suddenly felt very calm. I can't pretend that I don't. But you can pretend that you are a writer, said her mother sharply. I'm not pretending. I do write. She nodded at the precious pages. That isn't the first story that I've written. Oh, no? This sounds like more than a hobby. Her father sighed as though he had just discovered an even more shameful thing. Does anyone else know about this? No, no one. Well, Sadie bit her lip. Except, I did send a story to a publisher or two. A publisher? Cried Mrs. Owen, clapping her hand to her forehead. To put your name in print, said Mr. Owen. To let everyone know that an Owen was stooping to writing such things? I can hardly believe it of you, Sarah. It wasn't accepted, Sadie said, fidgeting. Thank goodness for small mercies. Mrs. Owen fanned herself with her free hand, though it was not at all warm in the room. Perhaps, she said, sounding as though she did not truly believe her own words, it would be different if you were writing something else. An etiquette column, perhaps, or, she floundered for a moment, searching for the words. Literature. That is literature. No, said her father sternly. It is not. He lowered the papers back down to his lap and looked down at them, shaking his head. Sadie avoided the accusatory glare of her sister and the disappointed fury of her mother and focused on her father, waiting for him to speak again. I cannot tell you how disappointed your mother and I are in what you choose to spend your time doing, he said at last. There are so many other things you could be doing that would bring benefit to others, something which I can't imagine you would claim your stories do. The fact that you tried to hide it from us suggests that you understand our viewpoint, and that you even agree. No, she burst out. He glanced up at her sharply. I don't mean to be disrespectful, father. But I'm not ashamed of what I do. I only hid it because I knew you wouldn't approve. And now that we are aware of it, he queried. What do you suppose you will do now? She lowered her head. I know you won't want me to continue. Of course not, said her mother. The very idea. For some time now, you have avoided taking your place in society along with your sister, said her father. You must put this childishness away, this waste of time. Brandishing the papers at her once more, he shook his head. And place your attention where it belongs. Sadie didn't know what else to do. Silently, she nodded. Good, said her mother firmly, as though it were all settled now. She clapped her hands together. Then we'll say no more about it. I'm glad that you will be fulfilling your true responsibilities at last. Mr. Owen stood slowly and extended the papers to his daughter, who took them with a quavering hand. I know that this is important to you, he said, his voice gruff but with an edge of kindness. And I have no wish to be cruel. But I also cannot allow you to bring this sort of embarrassment to your family, and I must forbid you to chase any more dreams of becoming a published author. Do you understand? Sadie nodded slowly. Yes, she said, her voice scarcely audible. I understand. Good. Then you are dismissed. Her mind in a whirl of distress, sorrow, and anger, she left the room and went immediately upstairs. She knew in her heart that it would not be a safe haven for much longer. Now that her parents knew of her pastime, they would see to it that she had more responsibilities to care for, so she would not be tempted to indulge any more in her dreams of writing stories for the public. Sliding the drawer open once more, she slipped the stack of papers back into their spot, tracing her fingertips over them one last time. Though there was no hope of hiding them any longer, she realized that it would be easier on her heart to have the tale of Elsie Courage and Benjamin Heartache kept out of sight. As she closed the drawer on the pages, feeling as though she were turning away from her children, she wondered whether she would ever feel again the thrill of writing or happily ever after endings. Sadie's suspicions about what her mother would do to keep her busy came true. Mrs. Owen certainly wasted no time involving Sadie in one event after another. Within a week, if she wasn't sitting with a group of society ladies planning a charity tea, she was agreeing to volunteer to sell raffle tickets at the next dance or trying desperately to form some opinion as to whether the latest debutante should have gardenias or roses in her hair. The truth was that Sadie found socializing exhausting. She always felt as though she were fighting to keep her attention on the matter at hand, while her mind would so much rather be wandering off into her imagination, plotting new stories, learning about new characters, and the struggle was already taking its toll on her. How could she make her family understand that this simply wasn't the life that she wanted, that she was suited for? Every night, lying awake and wishing that things were different, she tried her best to use her imaginative skills to create a scenario in which she was able to make her parents understand. And each morning, she arose knowing in her heart that it simply would never happen. If only there were some way she could make her parents happy while at the same time pursuing her dream. She missed writing desperately, as though it were an old friend. She did her best to stick to her father's demand that she set it aside, but her hand always seemed to be itching for a pen, her mind always wandering off to ride with the cowboys out west. She was dawdling over breakfast coffee, caught up in a daydream, rather unwisely, when her mother put down a stack of newspapers in front of her one morning. Sadie looked at the papers and then glanced up at her mother guiltily. Mrs. Owen put her hands on her hips. "Well, you always said you loved to read," she said. "Now you can use reading to improve yourself. These are the most important papers in all of the East Coast, and every single one of them has a society page. It's time you started to devise your own plans rather than simply going along with whatever your sister and I do." Again, Sadie glanced at the papers, which were packed with small black print. "Society pages," she said. "Yes." Mrs. Owen nodded firmly. "There'll be wedding announcements, charity announcements, births and deaths and debutantes and all manner of events. If these don't give you some inkling of what's what, I don't know what will." She tapped the top page with one finger, eyed Sadie severely, and left the dining room, leaving Sadie and the papers eyeing each other. Eventually, Sadie heaved a sigh and pulled the first paper toward her. "I suppose it's reading, at least," she said, philosophically. Unfortunately, the first society section was chock-a-block with debutantes, and Sadie simply could not get emotionally invested in any of them. After trying gamely for several paragraphs, she paged on through the paper, looking for anything that might be a bit more interesting. The phrase that caught her eye was, "Please write." Feeling her heartbeat quicken, she pulled the paper closer to her and focused on the little paragraph. "Well-to-do rancher of middle age seeks pleasant female company, not older than 30 and unattached, for an exchange of letters with the aim of eventual courtship and matrimony. Please write if interested." A rancher. And he wanted to exchange letters. Sadie felt her heart fairly glow at the prospect. Of course, matrimony was rather out of the question, but if it was just a question of letters, why, she could do that to her heart's content. They could be pen pals. Perhaps she shouldn't let on that she wasn't interested in matrimony right away. After all, he might decide not to write her back. And half the fun of writing letters was getting a reply, perhaps even more than one. The thought struck her then that there would most likely be other men in a similar state, just as lonely and looking for the same thing. And here she had several papers to look through. In some excitement, she began to go through them, looking carefully for any lonely hearts seeking correspondence. All of them, she noted, were also interested in matrimony, and only a handful of them even mentioned letters at all. But by the time she had gone through the stack of papers, she had a list of 10 or so addresses to write to, which she noted down carefully on a small piece torn from the first paper. "Please write if interested. Correspondence is highly desired. If you write to me, I will write you back, and we can get to know each other." Carefully stowing the ripped paper away in the middle of the stack, she tucked the slip on which she had written into her pocket and hurried out of the room. Her mother wanted her to be engaged in charitable pursuits suggested by what she read in the newspaper. Well, Sadie thought, her mother was about to get exactly what she wished for, even though it wasn't at all what she wanted. Chapter 3. Writing the letters was a delight. By day, Sadie did her best to pretend that she was developing an interest in charity teas and social seasons, trying to appease her family. Her mother even went so far as to compliment her on her newfound dedication to the papers. Once the day was over and Sadie went upstairs, closing the door to her bedroom behind her, though, she was free to let her mind roam while her pen moved steadily across the paper. She felt a tad bit guilty over what she was doing, but after all, Her own mother had said that writing itself would not be such an embarrassment if it weren't for the content. It was the fiction that she objected to. And what Sadie was writing now wasn't fiction. Well, not entirely. These gentlemen desperately wanted to interact with someone. She could understand that this was the root of their troubles, and did her best to pack as much information, wit, and charm into each letter as she possibly could. If that meant that she made up a small detail here and there, or told a little fib, well, she was only doing it to keep them entertained, after all. To one older man in California, she wrote that she had long been searching for a soulmate who understood the power of the written word, and who was not afraid of adventure. To a fellow in Nebraska, she suggested that her life had already been quite full of adventure, and the idea of retiring along with him to a quiet farm on the plains was immensely appealing. To a Nevadan who was a schoolteacher, she used as many $10 words as she possibly could, cramming them in with careful attention to spelling and punctuation. To a small-town mayor in the Dakotas, she wrote about her extensive experience with hosting genteel tea parties and organizing charitable events. Night after night, she inhabited the letters that she wrote, spilling out her thoughts and history, or at least, the thoughts and history of someone who vaguely resembled Sadie Owen. It was only in fun, after all. If she got a letter back, which she rather doubted, she would simply have to carry on the charade until the man tired of it. It was only after writing 9 letters and reaching the 10th and final one that her imagination ran rather dry, and she found herself sitting staring at a blank sheet of paper. At last, after several moments, she picked up her pen and began to write. Dear Mr. Martin, I must tell you right away that I am not at all certain about the prospect of matrimony. I am 22 years old and have turned away several suitors, largely through a complete lack of interest in anything they had to offer. I'm quite happy being a bachelorette, and if someday soon I slide effortlessly over the hill into spinster territory, I am quite confident that I will handle the transition with grace and aplomb. However, I am writing to you because I love to write. In fact, writing is my own great romance. I have long daydreamed of stories that take place in the Wild West, with cowboys and Indians, heroic men and strong women that forge their lives together against all the challenges they face, but I suppose even a daydreamer like me must know, on some level, that this is not the way for everyone. Any more than my family's way, entirely orchestrated by the interests and whims of polite society, is for everyone. I don't know yet what my own way is. I would be pleased to continue to write forever, and never have to face up to the reality of life as it actually is, but I know that this is not realistic, and as a strong woman with a mind of her own, I cannot allow myself to be forever wrapped in dreams and fantasies. I know that life always requires a next step, and so, as I sit here penning this letter to you, I begin to wonder if this is it. Perhaps this letter isn't at all what you were expecting to receive. I admit it isn't at all what I was expecting to write. But there it is. Yours with utter sincerity, Sadie Owen. She read the letter over, feeling mystified. Who had written that? It was both the truest and the most unexpected thing she had ever committed to paper. She had the oddest feeling that Elsie Courage herself might have taken over the use of her pen. Just who was Mr. Martin, anyway, and how had he managed to unwittingly inspire such honesty? She checked against her little list. Evidently, he was a miner or a prospector in Bluffs Pike, Colorado. Like the others, he was primarily interested in matrimony, but his request for a letter was rather more plaintive and simpler. I'm looking for a voice from the outside world. Well, she reasoned, she could provide that, at the very least. She managed to put all of the letters in the post at once the next day, when she left the house on the premise of paying a visit to a dressmaker. Now that the initial letters were sent out, the joy of her new hobby lessened somewhat. But she occupied herself over the next several evenings by imagining what sorts of letters she might receive back and planning out her own responses. A week went by, and then another, and she received nothing in return. It was a disappointment to begin with, but she reckoned that it was probably for the best. Besides, she could just find more gentlemen who were looking for correspondence and start the whole process over again. She had just made up her mind to do exactly that when, as often seems to occur, everything happened at once. Gerald Warner told her parents that he intended to ask her to marry him, and 10 letters arrived for her at once, that very morning. Taking the letters from the maid without even looking, she stared at her father in consternation. You can't be serious." He did not respond, only arched his eyebrows, and she wisely decided to reword her exclamation. "I mean, he can't be serious. We really hardly know each other." "You know that he is to inherit from his father and work with me," pointed out Mr. Owen, who somehow in his zeal hadn't noticed that his daughter was clasping a bundle of envelopes. "Surely those are the important details. I can't agree to marry someone based on that." "I hardly knew any more about your father when we married," pointed out her mother severely, leaving Sadie grasping at straws. "A man like Gerald Warner doesn't want to marry someone who isn't attracted to him," she said at last. He should marry Melly." She pointed at her younger sister, who nearly spit out the sip of tea she had just taken. "Melly would be a much better wife than I would." "As true as that may be," said her father heavily, "that's hardly the point. He asked to marry you, he wants to marry you. And while I will not order any daughter of mine to marry a man, I strongly suggest that you consider his offer as the best step that you could possibly take." His meaning was clear, and his gaze was direct. Sadie felt her heart sink. She felt the weight of the stack of letters beside her clasped hands. Through the distress of the news she had just heard, she began to vaguely register that there were rather a lot of them, far more than she had ever gotten before. I will think about it," she said miserably, unable to commit to anything more. "Who are they from?" asked Melly, now noticing the sheer amount of her sister's correspondence. Friends," Sadie said vaguely. "Nonsense," said Melly. "You don't have that many friends." Sadie shot her younger sister a glare. "May I be excused to address my correspondence?" she said, icily. "Of course," said their father, who was evidently not entirely unaware of how Mr. Warner's proposal had made his elder daughter feel. Sadie clasped the letters more firmly and marched out the room without looking back. She took them upstairs to her bedroom and spread them out over the desk. Reading one after another, her heart first thrilled, and then began steadily to sink. They were responses from the gentleman she had written to, of course, and every single one of them was interested, not in further correspondence, but in matrimony. Not even courtship, matrimony. Immediately. "Please say that you'll come to California at once. A man my age can't afford to lose any time. I was delighted by your masterful command of the English idiom, and heretofore request most humbly that you purchase a seat on the next vehicle that is venturing in this direction in order to take your rightful position at my side. A girl with social experience is exactly what I'm in need of. A mayor's wife has nearly as many responsibilities as a mayor himself." She put her elbows on the desk, her chin in her hands, and stared down at the pages she had unfolded thus far. It wasn't just a case of needing to write to each one of them. That task could be quite pleasant, in and of itself. It was the fact that, now faced with their keen interest, she knew that she must set them straight. All of them. Between these letters and the news about Gerald Warner, she had received news of 11 proposals that very morning. At any other moment, it would have struck her as funny, but as it was, she felt rather distraught over the task in front of her, which seemed almost insurmountable. She unfolded the last letter and was struck by it immediately. "Dear Miss Sadie. Well, you're right. I wasn't expecting the type of letter I got. In fact, the other letters I received in response to my advertisement were rather, dare I say, boring? At least, compared to yours. These other missives from Mrs. Bless M. were full of anecdotes about their skill at cooking and cleaning and conducting social experiments. That isn't the phrase that they used, of course. I guess they used words like event, and charity, and debutante ball. And tea. And I ask you, what use does a miner in the wilds of Colorado have for a woman who knows how to throw a proper debutante ball? None of those things mean anything to me, apart from perhaps tea. I guess I'm okay with tea, but as a drink, not a social occasion. The truth is that I cook and clean for myself just fine. If it were just a question of that, I wouldn't have ever sent out my request. But I'm looking for more than that. I want someone to talk to, and not just someone to nod and smile and ask me how my day was. I want someone who is interesting. Someone with a sense of humor and honesty. Someone who knows her own mind. Which is just about the sum and whole of your letter, Miss Sadie. I'm doing my best to be as honest with you as you were with me. Here I am, sitting writing you by candlelight, with only the dogs to keep me company, and none of them are much conversation. Am I a fool to set my standards so high as to hope that an interesting woman might be interested in me? Now that I've got your letter, something tells me that I have cause to be hopeful. I wouldn't want to push you to anything, Miss Sadie, but I reckon you and I might just be as well suited as ever any two people are. How's that for a romance? Waiting for your reply. Scott Martin. Sadie caught her breath. As she had done with her own letter, she read over his again, and again, trying to set it deeply in her mind. She had often written things like this herself, but she had certainly never received them in return. A tiny little curl of a thrill in the pit of her stomach told her that she was reading the thoughts of a mind much like her own. As she stacked the letters together and reached for a piece of paper to begin writing polite but blunt explanations, she hesitated. The other 9, she felt rather sorry for, but their letters had stirred nothing in her. The 10th, though, this Scott Martin was something altogether different. How could she simply turn him down like the rest? And then the thought began, why should she? At first it was just an offhand thought, but it made her put her pen down and give it her full attention. If she stayed here, she was doomed to a life surrounded by people who not only did not understand her, but who didn't see any point in even trying to. She was doomed to a life of never feeling good enough, of being constantly forced to fit a societal mold that she was ill-suited for in the extreme. She was, in short, doomed. On the other hand, here was the opportunity, quite literally, of a lifetime. She could write him back, tell him that she had reconsidered and was now open to matrimony, but that it must happen quickly. She would tell him everything, the truth about her family, about her situation. She would be honest with him and let him decide whether that was what he wanted. Honesty, he seemed to value it as much as she did, and that thought alone gave her hope. Holding her breath as though any noise would break the spell of her sudden certainty, she reached for a blank piece of paper and began to write. Chapter 4. Dear Miss Sadie. Well. It seems that each time I receive one of your letters, you're bound and determined to surprise me. I'm sorry from the heart for the situation you're in. I know a little about what it's like to be different, set apart from your family. Of course, nobody in my family is focused on society and respectability. Kind of the opposite, they're all lawyers. Leastways, all the men are. My father and grandfather, my 2 older brothers, and then there's me. I couldn't see myself settling down in a little house in a town and defending folks who were probably crooks anyhow. The way I've always seen it, those who find themselves in trouble with the law should be responsible for getting themselves out of it. Of course, that might be mostly due to being so intimately related to lawyers. Maybe it's not fair of me, but it's certainly the long and short of it that I've seen myself. At least, so far. Now, mining and prospecting is an entirely different thing. There's no law here, and not much call for it either. Mostly, folks around Bluff's Pike keep to themselves, and that's how they like it. If you never talk to your neighbor, he's unlikely to shove his lawyer on you. That doesn't mean we're entirely trouble-free. Don't be misled. There are a few rough characters around here, and that's a fact. But most of them are out at their claims year-round, and only venture into town to cause a ruckus at the saloon, which is the favored form of entertainment. Myself, my little claim is about an hour away, fairly well hidden. I can tell you honestly that it hasn't done too badly for me. I'm not rich, but there's always the chance that I might be someday, and in the meantime, I've found enough to keep me in dinners and socks, alongside a little garden and some charity footwear. I'm kidding with you, of course, but I guess I should tell you straight out that if you are to come and marry me, you needn't worry about being taken care of. I work my claim pretty regular, the garden is productive, and life isn't easy, but it isn't exactly hard either. The biggest worry is the occasional crooked miner who tries to jump my claim, and I can handle that. All this is to say that if you really do want to marry me, you would make me a very happy man, and I would do my best to make sure you weren't sorry for it afterwards. If your answer is no, please let me down easy. A few letters, and I can already tell that it'll be hard. If your answer is yes, don't tell me. Just come. My little house is 10 minutes from the stagecoach station. I'll check every arrival until I hear otherwise. Yours, and waiting. Scott Martin. Chapter 5. The first stage of the journey was a train, and Sadie absolutely wallowed in the romance of it. She sat with her nose pressed against the window for hours on end, watching the countryside scroll by, scarcely able to fathom she had made this decision. The enormity of it. Leaving home to marry a man in Colorado, and leaving home without permission, at that. She had only a single carpetbag's worth of belongings. Everything else had been left behind at her father's house, along with a very long and almost aggressively wordy letter of explanation. Was she sorry? She probed her feelings about the matter a few times as she watched the landscape change in front of her. Well, perhaps. A little. She knew that she would come to miss her family, in time, but she also knew that she had made the right decision. And though they might be upset for a time, they would certainly get over it without much trouble. In fact, they might be grateful she had made the decision for them and taken it out of their hands. She was certain that her mother and sister, at the very least, would have spent hours and hours trying to make Sadie worthy of society. And, as Sadie was quite sure that this would never happen, it would have resulted only in sadness and frustration for all involved. As for the offer of marriage from Jerry Warner, well, that just didn't even merit thinking about. She had a far more interesting offer of marriage to look forward to. By the third day on the train, the romance had rather worn off, and she was growing quite tired of it. It was impossible to sleep well, and there was such a crowd. She never had a moment to herself. Besides, the next part of the journey would take place on a stagecoach, a mode of transportation that held perhaps even more inherent romance than the train. She was rather looking forward to it. It didn't take more than an hour or two before she revised her opinion of the stagecoach. If she had thought the train was crowded, it was nothing to the coach. And there were no separate seats, of course, but she was wedged in with far too many other people, none of whom seemed to have bathed any time recently. She had to admit, on further reflection, that she herself had not bathed as recently as she would have liked. Was this what travel was, then? Constantly being jostled by sweaty men and women with fat arms and pointy elbows? The inn at which they spent that night was not much to inspire confidence, either. Once she arrived at the room which she was to share, she had to tell herself very sternly that this was a story. The sort of story she might write if she was trying to illustrate how difficult the heroine's journey would be. Then the wretched thought occurred to her that the journey might well illustrate the destination. Suppose Mr. Scott Martin's house was tiny, and dirty, and hemmed in on all sides by others like it, like in the poorer quarters of Boston? She hadn't even considered what her living situation might be, apart from being grateful that he seemed to address it so candidly. But he was a man, after all, and an unmarried man. Was it reasonable, or even possible, to think that his standards would be up to her own? She clutched her arms about herself and got gingerly into the bed, wishing that the journey was already over, no matter the outcome. But there was another day and a half to come. By the time she finally arrived in Bluffs Pike, Colorado, she felt as though her nerves were entirely worn thin, or perhaps she herself was worn thin, due to being continually crushed between folks much bigger than herself. Why did every other person on the coach seem to be so very large? But here she was, in Bluffs Pike, stepping out into the sunshine and fresh air at least, able to breathe, feeling a weight already falling from her shoulders. She had made it. Now, the only thing was to determine which of these fine gentlemen who were waiting for the travelers to disembark was Scott Martin. She stared. She blinked. She looked around at all sides. There was no one waiting. It was not difficult at all to tell who Scott Martin was, because he was not there. No one was there. The driver got down from his box and gave her a friendly grin. "Looking for your family to meet you, lass?" A friend. Mr. Scott Martin." "Aha. A miner, isn't he?" "Yes, I believe so." "Reckon he'll be up at his claim, then," said the driver knowledgeably. "They hardly ever leave their claims in the middle of the day. They'd lose too much time, and time's valuable." "He said he would be here," she said, stubbornly. "He said he would always meet the stage." "Well, you know best, then," said the driver, shrugging, and he went his way into the inn for an ale while the horses were changed for fresh ones. Sadie was just about to make up her mind to follow him and stew in her upset over a pot of tea when there was a voice behind her. It was a smooth, warm voice, but it sounded as though the owner had been running. "Miss Sadie?" She turned. The look of the owner matched the voice, too. He clearly had been running to get there. But after that, the next thing she noticed was that he was very handsome. Tall, broad-shouldered, large brown eyes. He clutched his hat at his heart, showing a thick thatch of dark brown hair on his head. When their eyes met, she knew it was him. Evidently, he knew it was her, too, because a brilliant smile spread over his face. "Mr. Martin?" He held a hand out to her, and she took it. For a long time, hand in hand, they simply took each other in. He could not seem to stop smiling, and she rather felt that way herself. This was the man who had written her the letters that set fire to her imagination and touched her heart. This was the man she had agreed to marry. "You made it," he said quietly. "You came." He glanced over his shoulder. "I'm sorry I was a little late, ran into some trouble today coming back from the claim." She shook her head. Right then, she wouldn't have cared if he had been 2 days late. Well, perhaps 2 days would have been a bit much, but she was in the mood to forgive. Was this what people meant when they spoke about love at first sight? She'd written about it often enough, but she'd never felt anything quite like this before. Certainly not with Society Jerry or anyone like him. "I don't mind," she said, breathless. "I would have waited forever." Another smile, or perhaps it was a continuation of the previous one. "Well, you don't have to wait any longer," he said. "Miss Sadie, will you marry me?" She clutched his hand a little tighter. "Mr. Martin, I certainly will." Chapter 6. Married life in Bluffs Pike, Colorado, was blissful. Perhaps it wasn't the easiest life. The house was indeed small, and she did indeed have to scrub it up before it quite met her standards. The water pump was a bit broken and didn't work all that well. 2 of the windows were cracked, and he'd put boards over them to protect them from breaking entirely. For some reason, he didn't even own a kettle, but made tea and coffee in a saucepan. On the second day, after their simple wedding ceremony at the church, she decided that she felt sufficiently like a wife to start making some changes and handed him a list. Scott glanced over it. "Curtains," he said. "Yes," said Sadie firmly, though she knew she was blushing. "Curtains." Scott glanced up at her, caught sight of her expression, and grinned. "Curtains it is," he agreed. He went off to the general store, and she set to with a will. This wasn't just his house, after all, it was hers, too, and while she wasn't about to change everything willy-nilly and yank the rug out from underneath his feet, so to speak, she certainly did have a plan in mind. And the rug needed a good beating, anyhow. Scott was a gem, however, and took to being a husband as though he'd been born for it. He stayed with her for a solid week after their wedding, apologizing only that he couldn't afford to take her anywhere for their honeymoon. "That's all right," Sadie told him, smiling. "There's so much to be done right here, I couldn't simply up and leave. Besides, the last thing I want to do is get back in that coach." The 2 of them dawdled long over breakfast, getting to know each other. They spent their days working on the house, cleaning and painting and repairing until it was something approaching Sadie's standards, and then they turned their attention to the garden. Scott had spoken truly. It was small but seemed to produce twice what a garden its size could reasonably be expected to. "I never had the chance to have a garden," Sadie told him honestly. "I hope I don't turn out to have a black thumb." "I'm sure you'll be just grand at it," her husband said, and when she glanced up at him, he smiled sweetly. It was at times like this that Sadie knew that her new husband felt exactly the same way that she did. Perhaps it was love at first sight. Even without putting a name to it, it was easy to see that she had made the right decision. Day after day passed without a moment of awkwardness or mistrust or contention. It was staggering, really. Even though Sadie had always been something of a romantic, she had never been so far in denial of the realities of marriage that she thought she could get away without ever having a disagreement. It was inevitable, she was certain of it, and the longer and longer it went without happening, the more she marveled. It was like something out of her own stories. But then, a week after her arrival and thus a week into their married life together, it happened. He broke the news to her over breakfast, as they were sipping their coffee, made in a brand new kettle, and spooning their oatmeal. "I've got to get back to the claim," he said. "And I'll be gone for a little while." "Oh." She deflated. "When?" "Today." He glanced out the window. "Right now, just about." "Are you sure you really have to go back so soon? After all, we've only been married a week." "I'm still getting used to Bluff's Pike." He glanced back at her and grinned, reaching out to stroke her hand. "I know, Sadie, and I'm sorry. I really am. But I can't leave the claim for longer than this, and besides, you'll be fine here. I've already walked you around town, so you know where everything is. Me being gone will give you a chance to get to know folks." He nodded, suddenly looking at her intently. "And you'll be safe here." She tipped her head to one side curiously. "Safe?" He nodded. "Safe. Does that mean that at the claim, you won't be safe?" He looked back up from his coffee and looked fixedly at her for a moment. "Sadie, I'll tell it to you straight. Here in town, everyone's as honest as the day is long. Maybe there's a little cheating on the tab at the bar, but that's about it. Out there, though," and he jabbed at the window with his thumb. "Out there, it's a different story. But you told me that miners kept to themselves. They do, by and large. But there's always one rotten apple in every barrel." She leaned forward, a little frightened, but intrigued despite herself. "Who is it?" she asked. He considered his words for a few moments before he told her. "His name is Russ Rogers," he said. "And I hope you never run into him, but I guess it's better to tell you what he looks like so you can avoid him if you do see him. Tall man, taller than me. Thin, too. Rangy, I guess you'd say. Gray hair, but he always wears a black stovepipe hat." She gasped. "Like a villain in a novel?" He nodded. "Just about like that. Russ is. Russ is showy. Not the sort of thing you see around here, much. Sure, we wear hats, but there's a purpose to them. Shade us a little from the sun, protect us a little from the rain." He nodded in the direction of the front door, where his own brown broad-brimmed hat hung on a nail. "Russ isn't from around here. He's from back east and came through Colorado just this past year, looking for a claim to mine. Well, turns out he couldn't find one of his own, so now he's looking for a claim to jump." "Yours?" she questioned, her eyebrows raised. "Mine, or anyone else's that he can manage. Trouble with mine is that I've had a little bit of success over the time that Russ has been here, and he thinks that he can mine it when I'm not around and avoid a fight." He snorted. "As though I don't know my claim like the back of my own hand, and I'll just not happen to notice if someone's doing a little digging when I'm not there. But suppose he decides that this plan isn't working? Suppose he decides to attack you?" She twisted her hands together, worried at the very thought. "He hasn't been able to find my claim just yet," Scott told her, reaching over again to put a hand on hers. "It's pretty well hidden. Some folks in town have a general idea where it is, but they really only know where my camp is, not the mine itself. And I'll keep doing my best to make sure that Russ never finds it." He shrugs. "As long as it's a secret from him, he'll leave me alone and just try to keep following me there. Matter of fact, he was the reason I was a little late coming to meet you at the stagecoach last week." She shook her head and turned her hands up to grip his tightly. "Please take care of yourself, Scott, and be careful," she said urgently. I know we haven't been married very long, but I rather like you." He squeezed her hands back. "I like you too," he said softly. "How long will you be gone?" "I hope not too long. Maybe a week or two." "That seems like an awfully long time to me. Can't I come with you and stay at the camp?" He shook his head. "A sweet little lady like you shouldn't be at that rough wilderness camp," he said. "You don't have the right shoes for walking there, for one thing. It's cold at night, for another, and for a third, there's none of the modern comforts you get here in town." She scoffed at him and he grinned. Well, let me put it another way. If you think Bluffs Pike is rough, you should definitely stay home. He patted her hand. Maybe I'll build a little cabin out there, someday, if the mine comes through for me. Then there'll be somewhere for you to feel comfortable. Do you think that you'll ever be able to do anything about Russ Rogers? She asked hesitantly. I mean, catch him in the act or something, so he won't be able to find you out. He shook his head. If I did, another one just like him would take his place, he said. It's bound to happen. Folks are generally good, but there's always got to be a villain. He stood up and pressed a kiss to her forehead. Or else what would all the novels be about? He smiled and went to fetch his things. Sadie sighed and sat still, looking at the deserted dining table. It was small and rough and simple, and she knew that Scott had made it himself. Most of the furniture in the little house, in fact, was obviously made by the same means. He was a hard-working man, and clever, and she was loath to lose him to some silly-hatted villain. As he came out from the bedroom, hefting a sack over his shoulder, she leapt from her seat at the table and rushed to him, throwing her arms about him. Please, she said, please do be careful, Scott. He hugged her tightly, lips in her hair. Everything's going to be all right, Miss Sadie, he said softly. Don't you fret. Chapter 7. But everything wasn't all right after Scott left. It wasn't all right at all. It wasn't necessarily that anything was wrong, of course, but she missed him so much. Truly, she was baffled by the strength and immediacy of her own feelings. They'd only been married for 8 days now, and she had only known him for approximately 1 hour longer than that. He had made a place for himself in her heart, as steadily as he was even now using a pickaxe and making his way into the mountainside on his wilderness-hidden claim. He left her one of the dogs for company, and she was grateful for that. His name was Towser, and he slept at the door to the bedroom, watchful and ready in case of any danger. But she felt quite comfortable, really. Scott had told her that Bluffs Pike was safe, and she felt that it was. No, it was worry over her newlywed husband that made her lay awake at night. Somewhat irritated by her own moping, after the 3rd day of trying and failing to concentrate on cleaning the house and caring for the garden, she dragged her box of papers from the bottom of her otherwise empty carpet bag. She hadn't brought all of her stories with her, of course, she hadn't had space. The ones she had left behind were tucked in a box underneath her bed, and she knew in her heart that she might very well never see them again. She had brought her favorites, though, especially the one where Elsie Courage first crossed paths with Benjamin Heartache. She pulled it out, laid it out on the little table before her, and began to read over it. He was tall and handsome, and carried his hat in his hand. His hair was as black as a night with no moon or stars, and his eyes seemed to match, but for the fire of anger that sparked inside of them. What's a woman doing out here? He snapped. Elsie Courage drew herself up, feeling that it was time she imitated her namesake. I own this ranch, she proclaimed. It was left to me by my father, and I've come to claim it. Benjamin Heartache narrowed his eyes at her. She saw him clench his fists at his sides. I'd never hit a woman, he said, but that doesn't mean you don't have a fight on your hands. No, 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 Sadie said out loud, taking a pencil and scoring across the words. She leaned her chin in her hand and stared down at the paper, shaking her head. Why had she always thought that love must be so angry? Perhaps it was her parents, she reasoned, they'd certainly had plenty of arguments over the years. Or perhaps it was that she hadn't yet met any love of her own. If she and Scott ever had an argument, she was certain it wouldn't be like that. She scribbled on the papers for a few moments and then gave up trying to fix it. It was no use, she would have to simply start over from scratch and fix it as she went along. She had no blank paper, and she certainly was going to need that if she was going to get back into writing, as Scott had intimated more than once he was happy for her to do. Her husband wanted her to write and was proud of her for doing it, just the thought of it made her heart sore. She should also, she told herself sternly, write a letter to her family and let them know she was all right. Half floating on the thought of her husband, half plotting on the thought of her family back in Boston, she left the little house and made the 15-minute walk to the general store. Their home was not right in town, but it wasn't far out of it either, which made for a rather nice space around the house and put her fears of being crowded to rest. A few nights after supper, she and Scott had taken a stroll into town, arm in arm, so he could introduce her to the main sights. "And show you off," he said, grinning. She had pushed into the side of him, embarrassed but pleased at the same time. With that introduction to the town, she knew where the store was, and even recognized a few of the faces that she passed as she walked, though she couldn't for the life of her remember any names. She tried a few times and simply gave up, resorting to a polite litany of, "Good morning, ma'am." "Good morning, sir." She allowed for herself, been rather distracted. But now she was in the town on her own, and it was as much her town as it was Scott's. "The man who owned the general store, Mr. Anthony?" "Mr. Andrew?" Gave her a friendly wave as she entered. "Good morning, Mrs. Martin." "Good morning, Mr. Good morning." She smiled at him in lieu of making any actual sense, and turned to her shopping, feeling her face flame. Behind her, the next shopper who entered matched his greeting with a cheerful, "Good morning, Mr. Ziegler," which made her heartily grateful that she hadn't even tried. It was embarrassing, but amusing at the same time, and she knew whenever she got the chance to tell Scott about it that he would laugh. Oh, she couldn't seem to get away from missing him. Everything that happened, every thought that she had, she wanted nothing more than to share it with him and make him smile. She spent as long as she could perusing the shelves, putting off the dreaded moment of coming face to face with Mr. Ziegler again. Eventually, she found the paper, and gathered up a sheaf of it, still dawdling. She went down an aisle that she had not yet investigated and found herself in amongst cloth goods. Bolts of cloth stood upright, shielding her from prying eyes, and she spent a good 15 minutes examining them, thinking vaguely of making herself a dress that was more appropriate for a married woman living in a little house in Colorado, rather than an escaped reluctant socialite spinster from Boston. There were a few ready-made goods, too, though none of them looked as though they would come close to fitting her without a great deal of alteration. After that, there were some shoes. The shoes gave her pause. Wasn't that one of the reasons Scott had told her she couldn't come with him? She didn't have the right shoes. Well, she couldn't exactly fault him for that. All she had brought with her were 2 pairs of social shoes, which weren't really meant to be seen other than underneath a full-skirted dress. And they had been the most sensible of all her shoes, too, with hardly a heel on them. But that wasn't the sort of shoe that one needed for walking through a great wilderness. One needed boots. She didn't have any boots, but she was certainly willing to look for some. And boots there were. It would be shocking if there weren't, she reasoned, given that the men around here were all hard workers and spent a great deal of time out of doors, either working farms and ranches or mining in the mountains. Of course, none of the men's boots would be at all appropriate for her. She doubted that she could even lace them tightly enough to keep from losing them at every step. The women's shoes, unfortunately, were not quite up to the same standard. Oh, they weren't as society-friendly as her own shoes from Boston were, but they weren't exactly made for hard work or long walks, either. They were flat, and the soles on them looked as though they wouldn't stand up to too much pressure. Evidently the women of Bluffs Pike did not spend as much time outside as did the men. She sighed, disappointed, and decided to ask Scott about ordering some suitable boots for herself when he returned. She certainly wasn't going to spend all her time indoors when her husband was working all by himself outside. As she began to turn away, her eyes caught sight of another little display, just a bit further down the aisle, children's shoes. Small shoes, plain black ones, for little girls and boys. And there, in the midst of them, a pair of small boots, clearly intended for a very young apprentice or farm boy helping out on the family homestead, or for a small-footed newlywed wife in desperate search of appropriate footwear. Without even thinking twice about it, she leapt forward and snatched them up. Yes, she could tell that they would fit her quite well. Perhaps a little on the large side, but she could wear 2 pairs of socks, and that would take care of that. And they were stiff, but she reckoned she would break them in with walking. What would Scott say when he came back and discovered that his clever wife had managed on her own? More than that, what would he say if his clever wife managed to find her way to him rather than waiting at home? The thought made her breath catch. She could find him and surprise him, wouldn't he be pleased? He said that some of the townsfolk knew the way to his camp. She would go there, he'd said it wasn't too far, after all, and wait for him to return at night. She could have a fire going for him and supper all ready. She would be the best wife he could possibly have, she thought, a bit smugly, and he would never be sorry he married her. She took the shoes and the paper to the counter, no longer afraid to face the shop owner. He rang up the paper with no more than a nod but broke into a smile and a chuckle when he saw the boots. "Aha," he said knowingly, "planning to go and pay a little visit to your new husband, are you?" Sadie lifted her chin and squared her shoulders. "Yes, Mr. Ziegler," she said with determination. "Yes, I am." Chapter 8. Between the store owner and the errand boy, and with the aid of a hastily drawn map on one of her new, fresh sheets of paper, she gathered the general directions to Scott's camp. She pondered over it as she walked back to the house, turning it this way and that. Landmarks were one thing, she reckoned, but poorly drawn landmarks were something entirely different. She prayed she would be able to find her way. No. She was certain that she could find her way. Would Elsie Courage back down from a challenge like this, especially when she knew that Benjamin Heartache was waiting for her at the end of the journey? She certainly would not. And her creator Sadie Owen Martin wouldn't back down either. Heart fluttering in her chest, she made her preparations. The boots did require 2 pairs of stockings. Blushing faintly, she elected to borrow one of Scott's pairs of socks to make up the extra cushion, as his were much thicker and more comfortable. As for her other preparations, she wandered through the little house, looking at one thing and then another, trying to settle on what must be brought with her. Scott had said he would spend a week or 2, therefore, she had to be prepared to spend that much time, as well. He must have food with him, but would he have enough for both of them? He probably hunted for meat, but suppose he didn't have enough coffee? In the end, she packed more than was necessary, deciding it was better to err on the side of caution rather than go without. It seemed rather foolish to carry a half-full carpetbag with her into the wilderness, but she couldn't find any other receptacles big enough to carry what was needed. She made sure to slide her newly purchased papers into the top of the bag, as well, along with a few pencils. Perhaps Scott would put her to work alongside him in the mine, but if she had some spare time, she was quite certain that the wilderness camp of the claim would be ideal circumstances for fictional inspiration. At last, shortly after 3 in the afternoon, she stood with her hands on her hips and examined the fruits of her labors with a critical, but ultimately approving, eye. She had rigged up one of Scott's belts through the straps, allowing her to sling the bag crosswise across her body rather than having to lug it by hand. It certainly looked unique, to say the least, but she was confident in her ability to carry it comfortably until she reached her destination. Now all that was left was to undertake the journey itself. She stepped outside in her new boots, closed the door behind her, and squared her shoulders to face the path. The roughly drawn map that had been given to her showed that she must cut to the left before she reached town, and head down a fairly well-traveled path until she reached a stand of oaks, at which time she would take another left along the edge of the grove until she reached a pile of tailings. After that, there was a creek that would cross her path at some point, and she must walk to the right alongside it. Only about an hour, she reminded herself, and set out with confident strides. Her confidence began to seriously wane when she never seemed to find the creek that was meant to cut across her path. It was the final step that was to lead her to her destination, and its refusal to present itself was cause for serious concern. Not only that, but it had certainly been far more than an hour of trekking. She eyed the sky anxiously. It must be nearly 6 o'clock, and the spring sun was heading for the horizon. Worse than the approaching darkness, worse than her uncertainty about the path itself, was the fact that she could swear she was being watched. It wasn't anything she could pinpoint. It was just the hair on the back of her neck, prickling up. She wasn't sure when exactly it had begun, but certainly she had noticed it just as she was passing the tailings. She even stopped and looked around now and then, searching for any sign that she wasn't utterly alone. Was it possible Scott had heard her coming and was even now watching her to see whether she could make it? No. She pushed the thought out of her mind. Her husband would never do such a thing. But if it wasn't Scott, who was it? She was well and truly out in the middle of nowhere, and the directions she had been given were not proving worth the paper they had been badly drawn on. She stopped for a few moments, shucking off the bag and leaning against a tree to rest. She closed her eyes. Exhaustion seemed imminent, and on top of everything else, her new boots had rubbed a raw place on one heel. Had she made the right decision to come searching for Scott? In her momentary despair, she thought, had she made the right decision to leave Boston in the first place? But that thought made her startle into alertness. Of course, she had. She could all too well picture what she would be doing, if she were still at home with her family, probably preparing to be married off to Society Jerry. Planning teas and slowly losing her creative skills, destined for a life of boredom and unhappiness. Instead, she was here, in the wilderness, yes, possibly lost, yes, but with a husband who would certainly come and find her once he realized she was missing. And what was more, she was determined that he should not have to. By golly, she had set out to find this camp, and find this camp she would. She pushed herself away from the tree, full of renewed energy, and looped the bag over her shoulder once more before setting out. A thought occurred to her as she went. It was past the early spring, after all, and perhaps the creek had already dried up. There was that spot she had crossed not too long before, where there was a stretch of smooth stones. Was that possibly the creek bed? She decided it was worth the chance and doubled back on her path until she found the stones. Yes, it certainly looked as though it could be a dry creek bed. She consulted the map. The next step was to travel alongside it to the right. Checking a few times behind her to make sure she was going the right direction, turning right from her original approach, not from her backtracking, she went on her way. The sensation of being watched did not entirely ebb, but now that she had found the last landmark and seemed to be going in the right direction, she was too focused on finding the camp to worry about it too much. After all, it was more than likely simply a curious squirrel, or some other woodland animal. Besides, darkness would fall soon. To her delight, it wasn't too much longer before she began to smell something delicious, meat roasting over an open flame. She hurried forward and leapt over the dry creek bed to the left as she spotted a glimpse of the firelight through a gap in the woods. Sure enough, there was the camp, spread neatly in a little clearing. And there, sitting on a rock picking at a guitar, his warm brown eyes reflecting the firelight, was her handsome husband. Scott. She startled him so much that he dropped the guitar, and only just barely saved it from landing in the flames. Sadie? Oh, I'm so glad that I found you at last. She rushed forward as he stood, and flung her arms around him, heedless of the heavy bag pushing her into him. What on earth are you doing here? His voice was clearly baffled, but she was glad to find that his arms made it around her in return, despite the awkwardness of the bag. Well, I decided that I would come and stay with you after all, she said. Mr. Ziegler at the store told me how to get here, but, oh, Scott, it isn't anything like an hour or two to walk. I left early this afternoon and it's taken me all this time, and the creek bed was dried up, so I got confused, and there's a blister on my heel. He chuckled, still apparently in shock, and helped her to take a seat on the rock he'd been sitting on. Hold on, he said, squatting next to her and putting his hands on her shoulders. Now, before you tell me what all went on, I want to make it clear to you, Miss Sadie, that I am kind of disappointed that you would just ignore me like you did. She blinked at him, puzzled. Ignore you? He nodded. That's right. I'm pretty sure I was clear that I wanted you to stay home. Otherwise, I would have brought you with me to the camp when I came. It isn't safe for you to be wandering around out there alone. Well, she floundered, searching for the right words. I didn't think you really meant that you didn't want me here. I thought you were just concerned for my comfort. In the face of his obvious concern and worry, she was suddenly overwhelmed by a mixture of embarrassment and upset. Did he really not want her with him? Was there happiness all in her mind? He evidently read her thoughts in her eyes and spoke more gently. It isn't that I don't want you with me, Sadie. If I could, I'd have you with me everywhere I go. But it is dangerous out here, just like I told you. You remember? She nodded miserably. Yes, because of Roger Brown. He blinked. Russ Rogers. Oh, dear, yes. I'm terrible with names. She put her head in her hands, and he laughed. "I wish you wouldn't have to remember a name like that," he said. "I wish that there was something I could do, just like you said, catch him in the act. But I can't do that unless he actually does something worth calling the law on him for, and it would be better to avoid that, anyhow." He stood up, knees creaking, and turned the meat on the spit. "Now, supper's just about ready, and you can tell me all about your adventure as we eat." "Oh, and I had planned to arrive in plenty of time to cook for you and make you glad you'd married me." She was so disappointed in herself, she could almost cry. Scott reached out gently, put a hand under her chin, and lifted her face until their eyes met. "I'm never going to be anything less than glad I've married you," he said, "and that's the whole truth." She felt a wonderful warm glow spread over her, banishing the disappointment and upset at the love she saw clearly in his eyes. "Then you're not going to make me go back home?" "I wouldn't even if I wanted to. It's not so safe for you to be here at the camp, but it's safer than you wandering around out there, especially in the dark. You can come to the mine with me tomorrow, if you like, and then we'll go back to the house day after." "How's that?" "I hate to interfere with your work." "Who said anything about interfering? I'm going to put you to work, forced labor. You'll wish you were back in Boston planning charity teas." She giggled. "I don't think you could do anything that would make me wish that." "Don't be so sure. Mining isn't easy work, you know. I won't mind whatever we do, as long as I'm with you, my love." He grinned. "Now you're talking like a writer. Here, have some supper, it'll make you feel better." As they ate their supper and talked and laughed together over Sadie's misadventures, she was reminded once more that she had made the right decision, not just to come to Scott's camp, no matter what he said, but to marry Scott in the first place. Watching his animated face in the firelight, she realized that she had never been quite so happy. Chapter 9. The next day at the mine, things were just as tough as Scott had warned her they would be. For one thing, there was the trek to the mine itself. The camp was situated at the foot of a steep incline, and the entrance to the mine was hidden halfway up the slope. It wasn't far in distance, but Sadie was not used to such strenuous exercise, and Scott had to halfway pull her up the last few feet, from boulder to boulder. At the top, they stood for a few moments, looking out over the valley spread below them, and Sadie caught her breath. The mountainside below them was heavily wooded, but it gave way in the distance first to plains with tiny horses running free, then to farmlands. She could spot the little cluster of buildings that must be Bluff's Pike itself. Beyond it, glimmering in the early sunlight, a river meandered slowly across the landscape like a silver snake. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Scott nodded, wrapping an arm tightly around her waist so there was no chance that she would fall. "It's what made me climb up this far," he said. "I wanted to see what the view was from here. Sat and had my lunch just over there." He jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "And then I saw a natural opening in the mountainside and started to investigate." He took her hand and led her back along the little plateau. "I had some experience with mining over the last few years, and I knew enough to recognize that this was a likely spot. Before I had spent more than a few days chipping away, I found a small strain of gold, and I knew I was on to something." He had evidently put a great deal more effort into it in the ensuing months. The opening of the mine, black and forbidding, was shored up with heavy timbers. Sadie grasped his arm. "You brought all that up here? All by yourself?" He nodded, and she felt him flex his arm beneath her grip. "Have to be strong to be a miner," he said and grinned at her. "Let's see how you manage, eh?" Of course, he didn't give her the hardest work, and she knew it. But even the tasks he set her to, sifting through the buckets of rubble that he carried out and dumped on the ground, for instance, quickly made her back set up and her arms sore. The rocks she moved were scarcely larger than both hands together, but she was unused to such activity. When he called a break for dinner, she was grateful for it. They sat together overlooking the valley and ate bread and cheese and some cold meat left over from the night before. Sadie found that she was drawn again and again to the beautiful view and had to fight to tear her eyes away from it. She realized suddenly that she had been very quiet for quite some time, and that her husband was watching her closely, a fond smile on his lips. "Happy?" he asked her gently. She smiled back. Very, she promised. She meant it with all her heart. Even though she was, indeed, very happy to be there with Scott, the afternoon was even more difficult than the morning. Her muscles were rapidly heading toward utter exhaustion when he carried out one more load of rubble and dumped it in front of her. He was covered in dust, his hair sticking up every which way, and sweating, but as she looked up at him, she thought he had never looked more handsome. He grinned at her. "That's the last one." "Really?" said Sadie. "I mean, are you sure? Don't stop on account of me, I don't want to get in the way." Scott laughed. "I can't afford to take my wife on a proper honeymoon, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to consign her to forced labor from dawn until dusk instead. We'll head back down the hill and have a little rest time before we make supper." "Oh, all right." He held a hand out, and she accepted it, letting him pull her to her feet. Her back ached and her legs protested. "I guess I could use a little rest, Scott." "Yes, dear. I'm glad that we're going home tomorrow." Another laugh, and he held his hand out to her once more, this time to lead her carefully back down the path. She was as glad to see the little canvas lean-to and the stone cooking setup as she would have been to see her own little home. "I hope we're able to build a cabin here," she said frankly, as they washed up before supper. "I do like it in the woods." "You like it more than being close to town?" "Oh, I don't know, I'm quite partial to our little house, too. I suppose I just like it in a different way." He nodded. "I can understand that. That's part of what I love about this part of Colorado. You can walk for 10 minutes and the scenery changes completely. Everything a man could want is here: mountains, forests, plains, civilization." He winked at her. "A pretty girl." "Silly," she murmured fondly. Supper was pleasant, just like the evening before, and the temporary discomfort of the camp seemed rather enjoyable to Sadie, knowing she would return home the very next day. As she lay awake that night, listening to the soft breathing of her husband beside her and the light breeze rustling in the trees, Sadie was fiercely grateful for everything she had, everything a girl could want. Chapter 10. The noise she was hearing wasn't the rustling of the breeze, and it wasn't the sound of her husband's soft breathing. Sadie swam up out of the depths of her pleasant dreams, opened her eyes, and blinked in the darkness. For a few long moments she stayed perfectly still, listening for the sound to come again. It was so still and silent outside of the lean-to, she could almost have believed she had imagined it. But no, there it was again, something so soft as to be almost impossible to hear, and impossible to define. Was something out there? Was it an animal? The remains of supper had been tucked away in a bag and hung from a tree. Scott said it would keep it from being eaten by a bear or other animal. But wouldn't a big animal like that make more noise? It seemed unlikely that they would be so silent, as though they were trying to avoid waking the human denizens of the camp. If it was a bear or a mountain lion, could she pass up the chance to see it? The very thought of it sent a thrill through her bones. Of course, they could be dangerous, and she knew that. She wasn't completely foolish, even if she was a city girl. On the other hand, if she saw one in person, she would be able to include them in her stories without completely misrepresenting them. It was so much easier to write about something you had actually seen rather than only heard tales of. This was the consideration that made her sit up, cautiously. Besides, it was just as likely to be something like a deer, not dangerous at all. She glanced over to her husband, who was sleeping soundly. He didn't move even the slightest at her own motion. For a moment she wavered, should she wake him? But suppose he made sounds upon waking up and scared the animal off before she got a chance to see it? Suppose he worried over it too much and forbade her to return to the camp for fear that she would be eaten by a bear? No, she decided, it was better if she just let him sleep and peeked out there on her own. If it looked to be something really dangerous, she could scream and alert him. She crept to the lean-to flap and raised it slowly, her eyes searching through the darkness. Dimly, she realized that there was just the faintest bit of spring moonlight filtering its way down through the tops of the evergreens, enough to cast a few shadows and illuminate the outlines of objects in the camp. She could just make out the circle of stones where they cooked supper, with a dim glow still coming from the embers, though they had covered them with dirt. A dark shape hanging in the air to the right of it was the provisions bag, tied up into a tree. But she couldn't see any animal form, nothing seemed to be moving. Frowning thoughtfully, she ventured further out of the shelter. She didn't quite stand up, but stayed hunched down, peering first left and then right. Still nothing, she took a few silent steps further into the camp, still straining to see. Then something strong and warm clapped over her mouth, an arm like a vice went around her waist, and a rough voice whispered in her ear. "If you want your husband to live to see the morning, you'd better keep quiet." Everything in Sadie cried out to make a noise, to scream, to bite the hand that was clamped over her mouth, but fear kept her silent. If he could creep up on them like this, then he could very well be capable of shooting through the lean-to and hitting Scott where he slept inside. The unknown assailant dragged her bodily from the camp and into the woods. They kept going for some time, and she immediately lost all sense of direction. By the time he finally let her go, pushing her to sit on the ground, she was completely lost. He moved away from her and struck a match, lighting a lantern. Even though she had never seen him before, the stovepipe hat gave him away. "You." The villain gave a little bow. "Me," he said, simply. "Russ Rogers, at your service, ma'am. And you must be, let's see, I heard your name in town once or twice." Everyone's all agog that the handsome young miner wrote for a city bride. He sneered. "Boston, eh?" "I don't see what that's got to do with anything," Sadie said stoutly. "I demand that you take me back to my camp at once." This time, he outright laughed. "Demand," he said. "Demand? As though I went through all the trouble of kidnapping you just to take you back to that lucky husband of yours? Oh, he is lucky, far too lucky. He goes for a stroll in the woods, he finds a gold mine. He writes for a mail-order bride, and he gets Miss Boston herself." He shook his head, and she could see that he had gritted his teeth in anger. "Why do you hate him so much?" she cried. "He's never done anything to you." "His very existence has done something to me, madam, by having, he takes away from those who have not." He got down on his knees beside her and took control of her wrists, roughly, though she tried to twist away from him. "Hold still, or this will hurt. Let go of me. I hear from the gossip in town that you like to write stories," Russ Rogers gritted out through his teeth, wrapping a rope several times around her wrists. "Well, perhaps you will understand the story of this, then. Your precious husband has been blessed with luck many times over, first with the mine, then with his wife. Now, he'll have the choice of which one he wants to keep, and which one he wants to sacrifice." He reached out and took hold of her chin, forcing her to sit still and look at him. "Do you think he'll choose love or money?" he asked, musingly. "What are you talking about?" "Simple. I'll go back to your camp, wake up Mr. Martin, and tell him that he is to hand over the rights to his mine legally or he'll never see his wife again." "You can't do that." He tipped his hat to the side and arched his eyebrows at her, looking more and more like the villain in a stage play. "Can't I?" "He won't give it to you," she said hotly. "Besides, you don't even know where it is." "Oh, that may have been true a few days ago, ma'am, but the shoe is on the other foot now." He laughed. "I've been trying to follow him to the mine for months now, but he always managed to shake me off. I could never get past the location of his camp. But all I had to do was choose the opportune time. I followed his wife, for example, and sure enough, he was too distracted by her presence to worry about anyone else who might be tagging along." He nodded, his eyes boring deeply into hers. "That's right, Miss Boston, it's your fault that your husband is in this predicament. You handed the mine right in my hands." He stood up and stretched, as though the effort of crouching beside her and tying her up had been too much for him. "I suppose I'd better be on my way. Don't want him waking up and worrying about where you've gone, after all." He chuckled and looked from her bound wrists to her bound ankles. "I don't reckon you'd get far, hobbled like that," he said, "but I wouldn't advise you to try, anyhow, for your own sake. After all, we don't want you to get lost." A final, odious wink, and he was gone, melting into the shadows of the forest, leaving Sadie shuddering and cold, and furious, on the ground. Chapter 11. furious. The word didn't even begin to cover how she felt about this situation. What right did a second-rate villain like Russ Rogers have to barge into their happy lives and try to take Scott's luck and make it his own? That certainly wasn't how luck worked. She wanted badly to give that man a piece of her mind, especially with her hands untied. For what felt like far too long, she lay still and raged against the circumstances that had led her here. Was it all her fault, as Russ Rogers had said? No, she couldn't take on that responsibility. She hadn't done anything wrong. It was his fault. And somehow, she would make him pay. She couldn't just lie there and do nothing while even now Scott was undoubtedly writing out something to pass the ownership of the mine legally to Russ Rogers. Sadie had no doubt about what Scott would choose, given the choice of love or money. Regardless of how Rogers tried to sow a seed of doubt, she was too confident in the love of her newlywed husband to even give a second thought to whether he would choose the mine over her. Although, he'd been working that mine for months, now, and it was obvious that he was attached, just by how he spoke about it. And of course, he had every reason to expect that he was going to strike it rich there. But no. She shook the thought, and the doubt, out of her head. He would choose her, she knew it, and she had to get there before he did anything that would hand Russ Rogers the victory he so clearly craved. But how? The ropes were too tight to wiggle through, though she had a certain amount of leeway. Perhaps she could struggle to her feet, but that would only leave her attempting to hop through a dark forest. She had only the vaguest idea of which direction to head in, based on the way that Rogers had gone when he'd left. She couldn't afford to take off after him until she at least had some mobility. The forest floor was soft and loamy, covered in pine needles. She wriggled about, her fingers questing through the dirt, looking for anything with a sharp enough edge to be of use. Aha! A large chunk of rock, part of a bigger strata that must run just below the surface here. She could not move it, but she could scrape the dirt off it and begin to rub the rope against it, hoping to fray the strands. The rock shattered into pieces after only a few tries, and she stifled a sob of despair. No need to worry, she told herself sternly. There was plenty more where that came from. What would Elsie Courage do in a situation like this? The answer was clear: keep trying. It seemed to take ages before the rope was frayed enough for her to twist against it and break it. Then, embarrassingly enough, it took almost as long for her to undo the complicated knots that were keeping her feet from free movement. At last, however, she was completely free and standing up, rubbing her wrists where the ropes had marked her skin, staring into the thinning darkness. "I'll find him," she said, with determination. "I did it before, and I'll do it again." She set off. This time, of course, she had no map, poorly drawn or otherwise. But she had been smart enough to figure out the dry creek bed on her own, after all, and perhaps she could determine which way to go by discerning it herself. As dark as it still was, the moon was out and glimmering through the trees, which enabled her to see where she was going and not run into anything. Did the shape of that tree look familiar, or was it just her imagination? She was almost certain that they had passed by that fallen log. She remembered the light reflecting off the dew in the moss. And those two trees there, growing so close together, he'd been forced to push her around them rather than between. Her heart began to rise, and her stomach began to twist into anxious knots. Yes, she was almost positive she was heading in the right direction. If only it wasn't too late. The voices were so quiet, the lantern lights so dim, that she almost stumbled into the camp before she was aware of it. She stopped dead still, heart in her throat, and stepped up next to a tree trunk to keep her shape hidden. The two men were arguing, and suddenly she heard Russ Rogers' voice explode loudly. "I'm telling you, you'll never see her again if you don't do as I say." "And I'm telling you," Scott said, his voice low but calm and cold with menace, "I don't trust you as far as I could throw you. If you don't take me to her right now, I won't do a thing. I need to see her." Russ Rogers threw his head back and laughed, though it was utterly mirthless. "As though you can dictate to me. I hold all the cards here, Martin, and I'll show you Miss Boston when I'm good and ready." "How do I know she isn't hurt?" "I never said she wasn't," Rogers countered nastily. "And for all you know, every moment that you hesitate, she comes closer to falling into her eternal sleep." The light of the lantern wasn't much, but it was enough for Sadie to see the agony and horror in Scott's eyes. She couldn't wait any longer. She had no plan, but her arrival took all the cards out of Russ Rogers' hands, if nothing else. She lurched forward, stumbling over a branch in her path, and ran haphazardly into the camp, crying out loud. "Scott!" Both men gave a shout, and both turned and leapt forward at almost the exact same moment, each trying to reach her first. Russ Rogers had longer arms and a longer reach. He dropped the lantern, which ignited a small fire at their feet, and grasped at her with both hands. She shrieked and leapt back, aiming a wild kick at his knee. At the same time, Scott shouted her name and went low, throwing an elbow into Rogers' ribs. Between the two of them, though neither fully connected, their combined force was enough to throw Rogers off kilter. He stumbled backwards, tripping over the remains of the lantern, and landed heavily and completely still. His hat slipped from his head at last, landed in the flames, and immediately caught fire. Scott threw his arms around Sadie and pulled her up against him, lifting her off the ground. For a moment, she could hear nothing but his breathing and the steady beat of his heart, and that was all she needed. Then he set her down and looked intensely into her eyes. "Are you all right?" "He said he hurt you." She shook her head. "He was lying to try and get you to agree to what he wanted." He lifted her hands, looking at them intently. "But your wrists." "He had me tied up, that's all, and I had to use a rock to loosen the rope, and you'd be so proud of me, Scott. I managed to." Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the firelight glint on something sinister and silver. "Scott, watch out." Her husband pushed her back out of the way, turning at the same time to face their assailant, and it was that motion that saved him from a knife in the heart. Instead, it caught him in the shoulder, and he cried out. "Scott!" Sadie cried. "No." But her husband wasn't anywhere being done yet. As Russ Rogers was pulling the knife from his arm for another try, Scott brought his other arm up against the man, catching him a wild blow on the chin and sending him stumbling backwards. As Rogers tried to regroup, Scott doubled both of his fists under his own chin in a boxing stance, despite the blood flowing freely from one arm. "Scott, be careful." "Yes, Scott," Rogers said, nursing his chin, which was rapidly purpling with a bruise, "be careful." He lashed out with his foot, going under Scott's waiting hands, and caught Scott in the hip. Scott grunted and started to go backward, and his attacker eagerly pushed his advantage. But Scott's fall was a trick. He dodged to the side as Rogers rushed forward, and caught him first one blow, and then another, one on the chin and the other on the cheek. With his foot he tripped him, so that the force of the hit sent Rogers forward and down, falling prey to gravity and pain. "And this time, stay down," Scott told him, breathing heavily. Sadie rushed forward to support Scott as he wavered between sitting down and falling himself. Gently, giving him as much of her strength as she could, she guided him to the ground, where he crossed his legs, leaned over them, and sucked in great gasps of air, glaring at the prone figure of Russ Rogers. "It's too much to hope that he's out for good," he said. "There's rope over there in the corner, will you tie him up?" "Gladly," said Sadie, scurrying for it. She tied him up, using twice as much rope as he had used on her, and gagged him with his own handkerchief for good measure. Then she turned her attention back to her husband, arriving back at his side just in time to catch him as he slumped sideways. "Scott!" He had passed out, and it must have been from the blood loss. She put a hand to her forehead, racking her brains. She had written about this, hadn't she? What would Elsie Courage do? Staunch the blood flow, wrap the wound in clean cloth. She had nothing to use apart from what she was wearing, which was far from clean. Hoping that it would be all right regardless, she ripped a wide strip from the bottom of her linen nightgown and bound it around Scott's arm, pulling and tying it tightly. At a loss for what else to do, and with her history of writing not giving her any more clues, she sat down beside him, between the two men, and pulled Scott's head into her lap so at least he was resting comfortably. Looking up at the tree branches arching over her, she realized with shock the light that was filtering through them was not moonlight, but sunlight. Day had come. It was tomorrow. She did not know how long she sat there, but it seemed like forever. Still, It was clearly still the misty light of early morning when Scott's eyes fluttered and gradually opened. He looked up at her, and she could have cried for joy when she saw the warm light of love there. "Sadie? What are you doing here at the camp?" "I thought I told you to stay put," he murmured, his eyes still misty from his unconsciousness. She cradled his head in her lap, choking back a sob. "You did." He closed his eyes for a moment, brow wrinkling as the events of the last days finally caught up to him. She just barely heard him say, "Thank goodness you've got a mind of your own." Sadie didn't know whether to laugh or cry. There they were, in the middle of the woods, having been attacked and finally overcome their very own villain. She didn't know how they would get out of this, but she was certain they would. Her husband was a strong, handsome young miner who encouraged her to be herself, and she was a city girl from Boston who had traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles to start a new life in a strange land. The last 2 weeks had been an absolute whirlwind, and there was no evidence that it would change any time soon. "If I was writing this story," she murmured to her beloved husband, as he lay recovering in her arms, "I would finish it here." The end, and they lived happily ever after. Scott's lips quirked in a small smile. "To be continued," he whispered. And even though, of the two of them, she was the writer, she knew he was exactly right. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.